19th of August is the official birthday of photography. It comes from the fact that photography was invented on the 19th of August 1839. Well, it was invented, of course, earlier, and there was some stuff happening among photographers or chemists and other scientists before that. But I do have a video about explaining why 19th of August 1839 is considered to be the birthday of photography. I will link it in the description and also in the end screen. Since today, 19th of August, is the birthday of photography, I thought it'd be interesting to look some things along the way. What has happened to photography? What has affected the world? What has affected photography in that time? Hi, it's Peter here, and let's get right into the business. I'd say that photography invention, or the inventions in photography, could be divided into two things. You have the big lines, and then you have small little things, small and big photographers, certain images that have affected the world and how we see the world and how we photograph. If we start with the big things first, of course the biggest thing is the invention of photography. That's for sure. Then the next big thing in photography was small cameras. First came the Brownie, which made photography available for the masses. And when we talk about the masses, for those who could afford it. When we talk about masses, it's all of us. Back then it was the ones that could afford it. And the second big thing in small cameras was, of course, 35mm film and Leica cameras. That opened up the whole new world. And what's kind of hilarious is the discussion during that time when the small cameras, started to appear, and photojournalism, which I will talk a little bit later, kind of was invented and was born, is that the photographers that used big cameras and tripods were saying that photographing with a small camera is not photography at all. It's totally something else. The real photographers use big cameras and big films because, of course, they were talking about the image quality, which is kind of hilarious that we still have that. We have not evolved from that discussion, which is kind of sad and hilarious at the same time. We still talk about image quality, and we still talk about the size of the sensor, and then that's when they were talking about the size of the film. We haven't progressed at all in that sense. So that was a big thing. The small cameras made it possible to photograph in places where only the big cameras were able to, where the big cameras were not able to photograph. And then the next big thing was, of course, there were certain things in technique, automatic exposures and some early tests of autofocus and all that. But the big thing, I think, was color photography, because up until around 70s, most of the photographs were black and white. The color photographs became mainstream in the 70s and in the 80s. And that was, of course, a big thing, because then we could see the world in color in photographs too, because we have an impression that, like in the 20s and the 30s, everything was gray and black and white. But no, it wasn't. There were very colorful times in what it comes to clothes too. But we have the impression that everything was black and white because we see only black and white images from that era, because it wasn't possible to use color film that, even though I think the first color films were tested in 1930s, if I'm not correct. I think there was some kind of a Kodak Autochrome or something like that. But it became mainstream 70s and 80s. And then came digital photography, which of course had a huge impact on how we photograph, and the amount of people that are photographing because of digital photography is massive compared to, let's say, like 70s or 80s. Even though photography was back then also a thing for the masses, but it exploded when digital cameras came to market, and especially mobile phones, which I will also talk about a bit later. And then the next big thing, which has just started, is AI. And I know, yes, AI image making or image creating is not photography. But the reason that it is significant is that it will affect profoundly the photographic industry. because it will affect every professional photographer who is selling images. It doesn't matter if it's a full-time professional or a side hustle for someone. It will affect and wipe out a huge amount of works from traditional photography. And my prediction is that in a few years we will have professional photographers or image creators that are creating images that have never taken a picture with a real camera. They might have used their mobile phones, but they're not photographers. They are prompt engineers who are making the images for us. And it will be so big, the wipeout for stock photography, advertisement, lifestyle, and all that. But of course, if you're a documentarist, a journalist, or a hobbyist, the effect won't be that huge. And for hobbyists, it doesn't, do anything. You can still do your hobby, which is nice, which of course we all appreciate. And then there are some other things, small things that are big, that has profoundly affected photography and the world. And some of them are just, some nice small things that are, I don't know what the word is, snippets of fun facts about photography, I could say, maybe that. And the first thing that comes to my mind is from 1861, when President Lincoln was elected as the 16th president of the United States. He was elected because he had a very good photograph of himself, and I believe it was this photograph by Matthew Brady. You can imagine that 1860, when you're campaigning, you can't travel across the whole country and, be at these rallies and election things and giving speeches all over not the world, but the US. So what they did in the Lincoln's campaign, they sent a photograph of him all over the place. They could copy that image and that photograph, and it could be sent. So it was seen by millions of people, and that's how they know, and that's why they voted for him. It was that photograph. That's what has been said, and I think it's very interesting. And a little sidekick and side note about presidential election and effects. Kennedy was elected, I think it was 1960, and his opponent was Richard Nixon, and Kennedy won because he could manage television. And then I think it was 2008 when Obama was elected, it was social media. Obama was able to use social media to his advantage. So there are things, these two things were just an interesting fact that came to my mind when I was talking about the Lincoln photograph. And then another thing that affected the society was Jacob A. Riis. I think he was from Denmark originally, but he was working as a journalist in New York. And there was a huge immigration to the States back then. And of course, when you get a lot of people and they had to live in pretty bad conditions, really small apartments, dark apartments, no electricity, nothing, just, empty rooms with a lot of people in them. And Jacob A. Riis was writing about that social issue in the papers. But nobody believed him until he went there with the camera and took the images in those dark places and published those images when people started to get aware and the politicians started to make some changes. Of course, the changes might not have been big and still the people live in bad conditions, but the awareness was rising and people understood that there are people living in really, really horrifying conditions. And one technical invention made it possible. It was the flash. They had the magnesium flash that was kind of like a small explosion that lit the room. And Jacob A. Riis could, with his helpers and with his crew, use that to light up the pitch black apartments where those people had to live. So that was one of the big things. And the collection is called How the Other Half Lives. I have the book somewhere, but I was trying to find it for this video, but just couldn't find it. It's somewhere behind my camera where my bookshelf is, but just couldn't find it. But I'll put a link in the description for you to take a look at the book, or Amazon link, so that you can see if you want to get it. And then, of course, Ansel Adams is something that we have to mention. for two reasons. The one reason is, of course, zone system. He was the inventor of the zone system, which I will have a link about the zone system in my description of this video if you don't know what it is. But what it is actually that making the exposure, you have a certain amount of grayscale values, and by making the exposure you can set a certain place of the image or certain certain tones into a certain place in the zones or in the grayscale, and it's still totally valid way of making the exposure. But I'll put a link in the description so you can take a look if you don't know what it is. And this other thing about Ansel Adams was that his photographs of Yosemite had a big impact on forming the national park system in the States, because he kind of like raised the awareness of the unique features in the nature in Yosemite, where he took most of his famous photographs, or some of them anyways. And then another project was the project of farming and agriculture in the States. That was the governmental project where certain photographers traveled around the States and photographing the conditions where the farmers lived. And one of the most famous photograph from that project was called Migrant Mother. The photographer was Dorothea Lange. And that image had a huge impact on making the lives of those people better. So these are the big things in kind of like living conditions. But that, of course, continued with the rise of photojournalism and magazines like Life magazines. That was the era before the television took over. People looked at magazines like Life magazines and had a glimpse of another parts of the world, big photographic reportage, and that was the heydays of documentary photography during that time, because it was that's the only way where people could see what happened in the other part of the world and what it looked like. And some of them were, of course, about the problems that they were, and some of them are just what we would call almost travel photography. And I know I'm not saying that it is just average travel photography. It's documentary photography that's been done abroad, but that kind of gives some kind of an impression what it actually meant to a average people who was looking at Life magazine. It was their television at that time to learn about the world. And then, of course, there were some photographers have had a really big impact. I'm not, there are so many, but the ones that I've seen the work of is, for example, Sebastian Salgado, who used to be a economist and then turned out to be, but started to make images and made some really interesting documentaries about different workers in different conditions, like miners and stuff like that. But if you're not familiar with Sebastian Salgado's work, and you can click the link down below to see more about that. And then, of course, there are, just one images that has affected the world, but there are too many. I might do a video about the most famous photographs and make a series of videos of that, maybe doing that later. But then there is, of course, our modern time, which is social sharing of images. And I think that's one of the biggest things that has happened now in photography, that everyone is photographing because everyone has a mobile phone. Or, well, let's say that everybody has a mobile phone with a decent camera, and some sort of social media accounts where they share the images either publicly or between the family, and that has changed the world. So like we say that JPEG or it did not happen is what you usually say. If you don't have a photograph, nobody believes you, which of course is in a way a good thing, because the power of a photograph is greater than ever, in a sense that yes, you need to have a JPEG or that thing didn't happen. You want to record everything, and also it's a bad thing because anything you do out there might be photographed or video filmed and then shared to everybody. So it can be used for bad things too. But in general, I think recording your memories, your everyday life is great, because it used to be in the 70s and 80s when film was really expensive. You only photographed, family birthdays and family gatherings and stuff. So you had one roll of film for the whole year. So you had the Christmas and the summer party in the same film, 4th of July and Christmas and birthdays in the same roll of film. But now it doesn't matter. You just grab the photograph and share it, and it can be seen instantly anybody across the world or the other side of the world. And I think it's still kind of fascinating when you coming from the era where photos were more private. But but of course you don't have to share your images. But what are your most profound things that you have found in photography? Is there a photograph that has had a really huge impact on you, or is there some photographer's work that has impacted you in a way? I don't mean that it has kind of like inspired you to photograph, but just to think about things, and has it had an effect on you? And are there any things that I've missed that should have been here? I know there are hundreds of things that has happened inside photography that could be in this video, but of course there's limiting time and I can't say everything that has happened. But for myself, photography has been a part of my life since I was 16 when I got my first camera, real camera. Of course, I got my first camera when I was 7 years old, but that wasn't really, I was just, taking snapshots and forgot all about it for like 6 years about photography. And then all of a sudden I started to pick up photography and studied economics, and then came to photography just to, feeling about it, so that it's healthier for me at least to be a photographer in a way. Maybe economically being a economist would have been better choice, but I've had a good life so far, so it has worked. And for me, even though I'm a professional photographer, so I kind of like divided myself into two, my professional me, and then there is the one that has a hobby. And I'm really glad that I never really ruined my hobby when I became a professional photographer. And there was, of course, time when I didn't really have that much time to do my own photographs, photograph myself. But now I do have a lot more time to do that, because my work is totally different than it was back then. And it's always been, for me, a great pleasure to photograph. I feel really good when I go out with the camera and capture something. And it's not about getting a perfect image every time. Sometimes I come back and I don't really have any images, but I've had the process of making those images and seeing the world, observing, and that keeps you kind of healthy in a way when you start. But of course, if you start stressing to get that image, then it's a different thing. Then it might be bad for you. But don't stress. Enjoy photography and have fun with it. It's one of the best hobbies you can imagine. I hope you enjoyed this video. And here is the video about the history of photography that was published in 2019. So it's 4 years old video. But hey, thanks for watching and bye for now.